Hey there. A few years ago, I met the CEO of a company called Fictiv when I was at a manufacturing conference in Washington, D.C. Fictiv is a company that networks CNC machining shops in California together so that when they have downtime, Fictiv will send them projects they can bid on and machine parts and mail them to whoever needs them. So this is something that I've wanted to try for a long time because it's expensive to have your own CNC mill. It's challenging to use, and you don't always have it up and running. So it's nice to have a resource for that once a year, once every couple of years opportunity when you actually need to mill metal parts. You can confidently send it to a company that will do that for you. So about 6 weeks ago, a group reached out to me, the Urban Land Institute, ULI, and they wanted to give away a trophy to this year's winner. This is a conference that happens every 2 years. And despite me wearing gloves here, there are a few fingerprints on this guy. But it's a lovely brass trophy. Really looks pretty. Let me put it up a little closer there. I know there are some smudges. We'll polish those out before we go. Maybe you can see a little bit of the back of the office there. You see my monitor. So I'll talk about the CAD files that we created from the sketch that the ULI gave us and what the process was like working with Fictiv, receiving the parts, and how I used JB Weld, this steel stick, to stick the metal rings into the base. It was a fun project, and I was glad to kind of cut my teeth on the process of using a remote CNC service. So again, this was called Fictiv, and it was a lot of fun. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the process where I had this part machined by Fictiv, and this was the first time I had done this, so I was excited to explore it all and glad to have a client that could help me do this. So first, I'm going to split my screen and I'm going to show you what the client originally sent. So I had a photograph of the first trophy that they made a few years ago. Because I was going to have Fictiv machine this, I first went to the Fictiv site and I wanted to know what materials they can machine out of. And so here I hope you can see there's aluminum, there's brass, there are a couple types of stainless. Then they can also machine plastic. Interestingly, they also do 3D, and I can scroll down and see a lot more. So they seem to have, they do have copper. I don't know why I didn't think to do it before, but copper can also tarnish over time, so I preferred to do it out of bronze. Note too that Fictiv can also do 3D printing, so they can also choose different materials here. You might compare or price shop between Shapeways and Fictiv. But at any rate, when I saw that they can do brass, I then contacted the client again and I sent them some example photos of brass trophies I had found online. And again, I think brass looks a little more trophy-like. It looks a little more golden than copper, which is a little bit redder. So I think brass is better suited for trophies. You know, think of the brass ring. That's what we're all shooting for. So once the client approved the brass material, then I needed to send the design files or the CAD files to Fictiv. And this is a pretty common issue when a designer or a client will come with what they want the shape to look like, and that shape is different than the components you machine to create it with. So it'll tell you the final shape, it won't tell you how to make it. So here, this was a little CAD drawing from the client that had the dimensions, the general shape. If I scroll, they did show the dimensions of these partial rings, and it's a very pretty trophy. And then here's a computer rendering of of the trophy. Let me pull it over a little bit here so you can see it. And notice, though, that this doesn't really tell you how these partial rings are affixed to the base. You could solder them, you could braze them, you could weld them, but the designer, the client, doesn't really always know how that's going to happen. That's up to the fabricator. That's who we are. So what I had done then is I told them, okay, I think that this component was created, or this whole trophy was created by these different rings, and I'm pretty sure there's a tab on the end of this ring that is inserted into a slot in the base. And you can see that the flat, or the partial ring has a flat here. I don't think that's just a machine flat part that was then glued or adhered. Could have been, but I don't think so. Doesn't look like a weld because the seam is visible between the partial ring and the base. So I had taken their simple drawings and I suggested that we add a tab to the bottom of each partial ring and that we machine a slot in the top surface of the base, and that's how these rings tab into the base. And notice too that if you're machining something with an end mills are round. So when you machine a slot into a base like this, it won't have perfectly square corners. It'll have the half diameter of the end mill as it goes in and machines through the base. So in order to hide that hole, you have to have enough of a land, you have to have enough of a flat spot on either side of the tab to cover that half diameter of the end mill. And that's why I think this is flat. It's possible that the tab actually really starts, is just about the middle half inch or quarter inch here. So I proposed this to the client. They agreed that they thought this might have been made by tabs that are inserted in the, into the base. And so then, based on that, I had a CAD assistant of ours take the rough shapes that the client had given us and added my tab and dimensions and slots into the base. So this was the kind of file that we need to be able to send to Fictiv. They need the actual CAD file of where the machine is going to cut the material out, how it's going to machine the base out. And so then I sent these to Fictiv, and there was a little bit of back and forth as they asked some more details about the polish, for example. Now, I wanted it trophy polished, so there was another add-on to the cost to have everything polished, and it took another couple days for them to do that. So there were 5 components which were machined here. Let me pull myself up here again. So we had 5 components. We had each of the partial rings, and then we had the base, so that's 5 pieces. And then there was another service, which was the buffing and polishing. And then they packed everything up, shipped it to me. And I didn't really know what tolerances to set for the tabs going into the slots. So I intentionally had the tabs, rather I had the slots a little bit narrower than the thickness of the material. Actually, I think I set them to be exactly the same, which would normally mean it wouldn't quite fit. So the idea was that I wanted the slots a little narrow, and I would file down the tabs until they were thin enough that I could gently tap into place. That way I'd have a nice friction fit, wouldn't have to worry about welding or brazing or soldering or epoxying, and that I could take my time hand sanding down either with a file or using a power sander, or even if I'm careful with it, a belt sander, to get the tab the right dimension to slot in. Turns out, as machined, the front 3 partial discs did friction fit nicely. So I just had to get a wooden dowel, put them through here, kind of gently tap that with a mallet until they fit inside. The last one was a little bit loose. So I put it in and it would kind of slot or fall to the side. So I used this JB Weld, which is great stuff. I used a steel stick, got my gloves out, pulled a little piece off. There's a gray and a black portion of that putty. You just roll it up into a little putty ball until it's a uniform color. And I took maybe the size of a pea or so and jammed it in the bottom of that slot, and then took the brass partial ring, pushed the tab in there, and it's set in about 3 minutes, and they say within about an hour it's hard enough to tap and machine. So it feels good and stiff. I wouldn't pick it up by any of these rings, but hold it by the base. And this base is pretty damn heavy. And this whole thing, I dare say, probably weighs 20 pounds. Oh, there we go. So let's see. I think I have some photos. It took Fictiv about 4 weeks to machine this part. There was a little bit of a hiccup, but they were great to communicate with. And let's see, do I have the photos I took of this part? Don't do it justice. Let me move this over here. There are still a few of my fingerprints on the trophy. I'm going to hit it with some Windex and a cloth to polish up. But the engraving was another cost that we had to add to the part. So really there were 6 orders. There were 4 partial rings, 1 base, an engraving, and then a polishing. And then there's also an engraving on the edge. And this photo really doesn't do it justice. Really can't see this very well. It looks great in person. These are not scratches. I had a little buffing wheel that left a few fibers, and those are fibers there. So the product came out great. I really didn't have to do any machining, and got an amazing part. Client's very happy. So I'll be using Fictiv again in the future. Oh, and let me also point out they had a really cute little packet that came with the product that shows who the team is, and they even mention a few nice things about some of the people, like Mallory, who has a Star Wars tattoo that says "Death Before the Dark Side," and it came with, oddly, a few little these look like laser cut wooden stickers. Yeah, this really looks like wood. So I'm gonna stick these on my laptop and other things. Maybe I'll start adorning part of the wall here with all the products that we get. So really fun stuff.